Welcome to Tree Pruning. This is a slideshow by me, Cass Turnbull. I work for Plant Amnesty, which is the world's only nonprofit organization to end the senseless torture and mutilation of trees and shrubs caused by malpruning. And we're going to see a lot of it with regards to trees. We're going to figure out what not to do, and then we're going to talk about what to do. And we're also going to talk about hazard tree evaluation and some other interesting specifics. But first, let's talk about our grantors. We got money to produce this PowerPoint slideshow from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, the Urban and Community Forestry Division, and they got their money from the USDA Forest Service, God bless them, and they need you to know that they are an equal opportunity employer and server. So thanks to both of them for allowing this slideshow to get out to the public. Let's start out with a definition of good pruning. Good pruning gets whatever you want from your tree or shrub, but while we do that, we maintain or increase the good health, aesthetics, and long-term safety in the case of trees. So pruning isn't anything we do for the trees themselves. Pruning is something we do because we want to change something to our benefit. Trees do a pretty good job on their own, growing and doing well. Our pruning is for our own purposes. But before we get going, let's go over the three kinds of cuts. There are only three kinds of cuts in pruning for both trees and shrubs. And if people just knew what was going to happen next when they make any of these kinds of cuts, all the malpruning in the world would disappear overnight. We just have the wrong picture in our minds. The top cut is called a heading cut, and that's where you just cut the ends of the branches off, and it is called a heading cut. Heading means to shorten, and non-selective heading or just plain heading means to shorten to no place in particular. And people get into a lot of trouble with the heading cut. They're hoping to make their tree or their shrub shorter, and they just whack it back to the size they used to like it. But one of two things will happen. Either it will die back and leave something called a dead stub, or you will experience an explosion of straight, skinny, ugly shoots called water sprouts. And these are growing 5 times as fast as the tree was before. And that's the bad news, because you just went out one day to make your maple tree shorter, and instead it's the same size as it was before, except now it's a mess. And our next reaction is generally just to whack them all again, because obviously it didn't get the message. However, when you do cut them all again, they come back, except they're exponentially more. Every place you make the heading cut, you stimulate more straight, skinny shoots, which are called water sprouts. Water sprouts are a direct reflection of too much or the wrong kind of pruning. Heading cuts are usually what gets people into trouble, and we will go over them individually. They're okay if you're trying to make something bushy, like a hedge, or if you're doing a training cut on something like an espaliered fruit tree. But by and large, heading is hard on the health of a plant. It's harder the bigger and older and woodier the plant, the more it becomes like a tree. The correct way to shorten a branch is called a reduction cut. That's the second one down. And of course, there has to be 2 names for everything in horticulture and arboriculture. And so it used to be called the selective heading cut. Now it's called the reduction cut. And that's actually a pretty good change because it reduces the length of the branch. And to do that correctly, you find the branch that sticks out over the chimney or over the walkway. You follow it back to a side branch which is large enough, and you cut it off there at a fork. And if that side branch is large enough, you don't get water sprouts and you don't get dieback. What you get is a briefly shorter branch, and as that branch continues to grow, it does so and looks natural. See that right-handmost branch? You don't get water sprouts, you get nice-looking branches. And of course, the big question is, how big is big enough? And the answer, like all good answers, is it depends. It kind of depends on what you're pruning. In general, trees, as opposed to shrubs, need a really large side branch in order for this to work. And what do I mean by work? I mean no water sprouts and no dieback. How the A300 pruning standards state this is that you prune back to a lateral, that means side branch, that is big enough to assume the terminal role, which means it turns into the new branch. You don't get dieback, you don't get water sprouts. And the sliding scale of how big that side branch should be ranges probably from a third the size of the parent stem to as big as you can get, probably 2/3 the size of the parent stem. And I suppose right in half would be that the side branch is at least a half the diameter of the parent stem. So you can do a little geometry with that and figure out what I just said. And if you do that, you will not make a terrible mistake on your tree. The third kind of a cut is called a removal cut or a thinning cut. And by removal, we mean remove it completely back to where it began as a bud. Notice that the middle illustration and the lower illustration look a lot alike because in both cases we're cutting to a fork, but one reduces the length of a branch and the other one takes it off completely. A removal cut would be like taking off the lower limbs of a tree as it grows up. You want some clearance for your lawn furniture or your mower or, pedestrian traffic or truck traffic if it's a street tree. And it also means thinning out, which is what we do with trees to make them look daintier and nicer, is we will use a series of removal cuts to thin it out and make it look good. All things being equal, a arborist, that's a tree person, prefers removal cuts to reduction cuts because removal cuts are the nicest and kindest cut to your tree. And why do we care? If the health of the tree is maintained or improved, your tree lives a long time and looks good. And not to repeat myself too often, you don't get water sprouts and you don't get dieback. Here are a series of cuts that you might see on a tree. The rightmost one is a removal cut back to the collar. And that's a pretty serious side branch. That's probably the largest a side branch you would take off would be half the diameter of the parent stem. The next one in the middle is also a removal cut, taking off the side branch that's a subset of the parent stem. The leftmost one is a reduction cut because we're not taking off that little lateral completely, we're just shortening it to a side branch. So now you have seen the kinds of cuts. And we can go on to all the things that you can do wrong. And the number is just almost endless, and people do seem to embrace malpruning with quite a bit of gusto. It comes almost naturally to people. I'm pretty sure that as soon as man emerged from the caves with cutting implements, they went out and cut off the top of a tree, and it felt good. Unfortunately, that's really bad for trees, and Plant Amnesty has been trying to convince people not to do that ever since. Or anyway, that's how it seems. Malpruning comes in a variety of flavors: topping, tipping, lion's tailing, over-thinning, and over-skirting. And we'll go over those one at a time. If you stay away from the big mistakes with trees, you're more than halfway home. Topping is when you just cut back the major branches of a tree. Topping is something that can only happen to a tree. It doesn't happen to a shrub. And it's a very large heading cut. A smaller heading cut would be called heading or tipping. A large heading cut is called a topping cut. And by large, it kind of depends on the size of your tree, but over 4 inches in diameter is a good general reference for a middle-aged, mid-sized tree. If you top your deciduous tree, some of those branches die back and other ones explode into water sprouts, and you get a real mess on your hands, and it can ruin your view. A lot of people are hoping that tree topping is going to be the way to save their tree and their view, and instead it ruins both. It ruins the view. Some people actually see a butchered tree with water in the background, and also those water sprouts get right back up over the water in almost no time. On the bottom shows a topped conifer, which we have a lot of around the Pacific Northwest, like Doug firs, spruces, and western red cedars. And they do not water sprout back as quickly, and they do not rot as much, but they will water sprout and they will rot. And another bizarre thing happens, which is the next 2 lowest limbs start to grow out and up. And that looks pretty weird and ruins your view as well. This is what I mean by the water sprout regrowth on a topped deciduous tree. Not very attractive, and this is only a couple of years worth of regrowth. It takes only a fraction of the time for it to reach the size it was before. I think that people think that they're like cutting hair when they prune. You can kind of keep your hair any length you want by just going in and having it cut every month. But if your hair worked like a branch and you gave it a haircut to ear length, it would be down to your shoulders overnight and really bushy. That's how trees and shrubs work. They work different than hair. This is the flying wedge on a conifer. It used to be, a cone-shaped plant, but after it's topped, the next two lowest limbs start heading out and up, and you get those shoots in the center. They're called water sprouts, but the technical term is epicormic shoots, if you feel inclined to throw around some technical jargon. And here we have the results of the topping cut on a conifer. You can see where the cut was made. It's the size of the circle, and the trunk will rot out exactly that size. The rotting organisms start to chew their way down the trunk, and the only sound bits of wood are the new rings that are put on afterwards. This is not good. We do not want rot to enter the center of our tree because it makes it unsafe and reduces its lifespan. The only sound rings are the ones put on after the cut. If you ever see a hollow tree, that's the size the tree was when it was topped. How far down that rot chews or goes is highly dependent on the species of your tree. Some of them are good compartmentalizers, and they will just kind of stop up the rot as it's trying to chew its way down the trunk, and it won't get very far. And other ones, called rotters, are not good compartmentalizers, and your old tree will quickly rot, by which I mean up to 20 years, down to the base. And that would be things like birches and willows and big leaf maples are not good compartmentalizers. Conifers tend to be pretty good compartmentalizers, but there's a lot of variation according to species and even within a species. Also notice that the left-hand branch used to go straight out, parallel with the ground, but now it's turned up and it's trying to be the new top. Arborists call this configuration a dogleg for obvious reasons. Here's a conifer that was topped just underneath the roof level 20 years ago, and it grew up with 3 new trunks, which are called leaders, and they broke out in a windstorm, 1, 2, 3 on different rooms of the house. So a good way to make your tree dangerous is to top it. The branches that regrow are frequently poorly attached, and a lot of the times they're attached to a rotten core. So one of the reasons Plant Amnesty started the crusade to end tree topping is it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't keep trees small. It doesn't make them safe. It doesn't save the view. In fact, it doesn't do any of the things that it's supposed to do. So now you know. This is a slide of a purple leaf plum tree that has been headed into kind of a ball. All those little white dots are where somebody went up with their loppers and just clipped it into a nice tidy ball. But this is not good pruning either. This is the heading cut, and you will get that upsurge of water sprouts, which are a nightmare to control and you can never get rid of. Here's that same tree a year or two later, and you can see all the numerous shoots that have to get cut off. And, this guy does it every spring right before it blooms, so it doesn't. Just a little nuttiness for people that have too much money and too much time on their hands. This is a great exercise in futility. See this tidy little tree? I know something very wrong has happened to it because trees don't come that tidy naturally. Somebody's been out there exercising their will, and it would be great if it would just stay that way, but it will cause an upsurge of crazy regrowth. I call this the Hydra Effect because every time you take off one of these shoots, 3 grows in its place. In case you missed that day in junior high school, Hydra was this giant serpent that Hercules battled, and he cut off its head and 2 grew in its place. And he cut off those heads and 4 came back. And so people create these Hydra monsters in their backyard when they just went out one day to try and make things tidier and shorter. And we want to avoid doing that.